It is 3/10 of 2015. We continue with Alexander Kojeve, and I have to hand it to him. He's really starting to get back into organizing his structure now in Volume 2. The last lesson was a very good look at how the structure was going to come together, and he continues that in this lesson. He's going to get into the doctrine of tendency. He almost sounds like a Moltmann to me instead of a Hegel, but it's really an important lesson. He talks about the tendency of moving from potentiality to actuality with regard to the right, or in his case, from the concept of Dunamis to the concept of Energia. So we'll look at these three moments. They're the three moments that really define his doctrine of tendency, and they really help us to get a better visualization of his structure. The first moment is what he calls the exhausted Dunamis and the emerging Dunamis. The potential Dunamis is the ideal that eventually reaches notion within self-consciousness, and once it reaches notion, then it is said to possess authority. So any notion of the real or notion of the true. Remember in Volume 1, he called the realm of the notion of the real, that internal externality of positing. Well, once our ideality reaches a notion of the real, then it acquires at that same time the aspect of authority. The potential Dunamis is also known as the acceptable custom of the exclusive juridical group within externality, within history. As custom, the Dunamis right has been applied to interactions within the juridical group in history. And every potential state entity has a tendency to go from ideality to reality as notion. So there's a tendency of the ideal to be taken up by self-consciousness and to self-actualize toward notion of the true or notion of the real. That just seems to be the tendency as far as Kojeve is concerned. Now we'll move on from there. We're going to take a look at the second moment, which is going to be key, because remember, Volume 2 is all about the second moment of the sphere of right, and so here again you see that most of our notes are going to be in the second moment of the impotent Energia and the emerging efficacious Energia. Now, right as Energia seeks to rest on authority rather than on force, to reach authority, the Energia right must be equal to its Dunamis right. Authority equals absolute correspondence. So the Dunamis right of the potentiality of the notion of the true, once it is posited and it acquires the Energia right of actuality, if it is actually fully actualized to where it's equal to the Dunamis notion of the real, that is said to represent an aspect of authority. Absolute correspondence equals authority. Now the Energia right can exist in one of two ways. It can be a just right, where the Energia right fully corresponds to the Dunamis right and therefore has authority, or it can be unjust, where the Energia right does not correspond to the Dunamis right and therefore is upheld through force. That's when the governmental right is not in unison with the state universality. When that happens, you have an unjust right being forced. So it can be either a just right of absolute correspondence or an unjust right where that correspondence is lacking. Now the Energia right is empowered in one of two ways. It's either a potent right, where the Energia right is considered efficacious because it equals and is supported by the Dunamis right. So now we understand how he's using that term efficacious. A right is efficacious and speaks to the promotion of the anthropogenic act and the development of humanity if it can match the and be corresponding to the Dunamis notion of the real or notion of the true. So it can be an efficacious right, but it could be an impotent right, where the Energia right does not correspond to the Dunamis right because all the potentiality has been exhausted. And so then it falls back into being a non-efficacious or an impotent right. And then we are pressured to replace the exhausted Energia right with a new emerging efficacious right. So how does this take place? A, the impotent right of limited correspondence to Dunamis right fades away to what Kojeve calls the ideality of the past, and the new potentiality of Dunamis emerges. Remember that Dunamis has a self-actualizing power. It emerges and has a tendency to self-actualize while in the same moment negating the impotent right that's fading away. This emerging Energia right possesses the efficacy of correspondence. It becomes efficacious and powerful. A new right of authority replaces the old right of force, because obviously if the old one lacked correspondence, it was being upheld through force, and so a right of authority replaces a right of force. The old unjust right of lacking correspondence tends to its own annihilation. At times, this transition includes the exclusive juridical group in history actually being involved in an educating process to educate the governmental group and the governmental right to understand that this transition is necessary to reach a notion of the real and reach a notion of the true that supports an authoritative right that the state endorses with universality. So sometimes education is necessary to be coupled with that transition. There is a tendency for every potentiality of real notion to actually self-actualize. Kojeve has mentioned that before, but the idea of positing, the idea of notion, is really kind of a self-actualizing process. It actually, there's power in language, there's power in the speech act in itself. And so notion just automatically has an inherent ability to self-actualize. Now his third moment is going to be the alteration that takes place in order to reach a transcendence of universality. Now authority can be attributed to an Energia right in a number of ways, he says. It can be just by corresponding to Dunamis, we just discussed that. It could be claimed authoritative because of a tradition. It could be claimed as authoritative because it is rationally applicable, or simply because it possesses an efficacious empowerment. So there are various overlapping ways that an Energia right in actuality can be supported as actually being authoritative. Now expansion occurs, and I should define what he means by expansion there. When he says expansion, he means the ability for an Energia actuality of right to influence more and more social interactions, heading toward the goal of trying to influence all social interactions, is what's called expanding the Energia right. And he says this takes place through a dialectic between preservation and transcendence. The Energia right attempts to preserve its correspondence with Dunamis right for as long as it possibly can. It tries to sustain its own existence and stay attuned precisely to that Dunamis right of the ideal, of the real, of the true. But Energia right also tries to influence as many social interactions as it can as a self-propagation. So it also wants to expand its influence. So Energia right realizes that it can only infiltrate more social interactions by altering itself, and that means to take up that internal positing of the self-consciousness which is influenced by the concept of universality, taking up the critique of universality. That takes you all the way back to Volume 1, but in order to expand that Energia right and to expand its incarnating influence, it must alter itself according to the concept of universality. Therefore, propagation involves alteration in order to expand its efficacy, its ability to influence social interaction. So it's, of course, that is, this entire lesson is a very precise summary of Hegel, because Hegel, his doctrine of the dialectic is 3 moments of negation, preservation, and transcendence. And that's basically what we have here. We've got Kojeve saying that within the doctrine of the right, we can talk about tendency as an empowerment that moves through the moments of negating the impotent right that's fading away, and then seeking to reach a preservation of correspondence to the newly emerging dunamis of potentiality in the notion, and then taking on that alteration of universality in order to influence more and more of social interactions, which is another way to say to take on the aspect of transcendence, to actually be the transcendence of a society or the transcendence of a state. So it's very much a Hegelian summary of Hegel's dialectic, but applied to the ethics of right and to the, of course, the second moment primarily, because that's where Kojeve is focused. So we're always dealing with the moment 2, which is the sphere of right, which means energia, actuality, having already left the internal externality of potentiality, which he calls dunamis. So it's all about that transition from dunamis to energia, and that means negating that unjust and supporting the emergence of the just right that it wants to fully correspond with the notion of the true and the notion of the real. Correspondence is authority. Correspondence is true universality. A limited taking up of that correspondence, or just a partial correspondence, is always going to be a deformed governmental right. It's not going to be a truly corresponding universal governmental right. It's always going to be something that has to be slightly maintained by force, and it can't really just self-actualize and sustain itself with authority because it'll lack that absolute correspondence. So the governmental right needs to fully take up